Good evening, and again, thank you for joining us as we open up our Bibles and study the book of First Kings. Now, last couple of weeks we have done the introduction and we've looked at the first two chapters of First Kings. This week we're going to continue. We're going to look at First Kings chapter 3. Now, Solomon had a real rough start. We talked about the fact that his brother tried to steal his throne, and then he followed the advice of his father, and his reign begins with killing political adversaries of David. And we see that chapter 3 is going to begin actually in a pretty bad way too. It gets better, and it's interesting to see how God interacts with Solomon. But we go ahead and begin. Let's read through the chapter, and we'll discuss it as we go. Verse 1 says, "Now Solomon made a treaty with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married Pharaoh's daughter. Then he brought her to the city of David until he had finished building his own house, and the house of the Lord, and the wall around all of Jerusalem. Meanwhile, the people sacrificed at the high places because there was no house built for the name of the Lord until those days. And Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David, except that he sacrificed and burned incense at the high places." All right, now, a few things here. First off, we see that the Bible tells us that Solomon loved the Lord, and that's true. He follows after him, but there's a couple of things right at the beginning here. He makes a treaty with Pharaoh. Pharaoh was someone that he should have never made an alliance with. He should never have actually tried to have a treaty with him. If you remember, God told the Israelite people, don't marry the foreign nation's daughters. Don't, give your sons to them. Don't take their daughters. Don't do any of this type of stuff. He says, trust in me. Trust, marry within your feet with your people. And don't allow the outside influences to corrupt you. And this is exactly what's going to happen with Solomon. We understand that, this is Solomon's first recorded wife, but he's going to marry and marry and marry, and eventually it's going to result in these wives pulling his heart away from God. So it's interesting to see that verse 1 says that, he marries the daughter of Pharaoh, and verse 3 ends with him actually walking and loving God. But between that, there's a couple other issues. We're told that Solomon worships God by offering in the high places. Now, we see that in a couple of places. In Deuteronomy chapter 12, we're told, "You shall surely destroy all the places where the nations whom you shall dispossess serve their gods." It continues on to tell us all these high places where they worship their pagan gods, destroy them. Get rid of them, tear them down. You think about the story of Gideon, how he destroyed his own father's tree groves where they were, using to worship the false gods. You think of some of the other places. The idea here is that Solomon and the people are still worshiping God, but they're worshiping him in a way that is inappropriate. They've gone up to worship him in the high places, and this is a ancient custom which they thought, the higher you are, the closer you are to God. Consider the Tower of Babel. Let's build as a tower that can last forever. Let's reach the heavens. Let's reach God. So Solomon's still making this mistake. We see in Deuteronomy 12 that they were supposed to actually tear all these things down. We see in 1 Kings chapter 22 that speaking of Asa, speaking of the son of Asa, in verse 43 he says, "He walked in all the ways of Asa his father. He did not turn aside from it, doing what was right in the sight of the Lord, yet the high places were not taken away." So this is a problem that's going to continue throughout the history of the kings. So, we're going to see that this continues, this idea that the people of Israel never turn away fully from pagan worship. Even though they're worshiping God, for the most part, they're still worshiping him in the manner of the pagans. Now, verse 4 is really interesting because verse 3 tells us that what he's doing is wrong, but then in verse 4 we see that God is ignoring it. And it's really interesting to see how God overlooks certain things. And we know that he does this a lot in times past. We know that during the law of Moses and during the kings that God ignored a lot of problems. The very fact that David had multiple wives, that Solomon had multiple wives. We read that in Matthew chapter 19, Jesus says, from the beginning it was one man, one woman. Well, God, he allowed these individuals to have multiple wives, and we never see any real, condemnation of it. So this is another one of those examples where God ignores the shortcomings of his people and still uses them to better serve him. In verse 4, it says, "Now the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. And Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on the altar. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, 'Ask, what shall I give you?'" So, despite the fact that he's not serving God in the correct way, God is still trying to work with him. He's still trying to steer him and guide him towards proper service and proper obedience to him. In verse 6, and we'll go ahead and read all the way to the end of this because this is the great point. This is the highlight of Solomon's life. If you want to look at anything, in my opinion, and take that for what it's worth, but in my opinion, chapter 3, this verse 6 through 15, this is the greatest point in the life of Solomon. It's better than him building the temple, and we're going to look at that later. It's better than anything because this is the point in which he genuinely shows who he is inside. And if he would just hold on to this, if Solomon had just remained, this man, then his life would have gone very differently than what it does. So let's go ahead and read. It says, "And Solomon said, 'You have shown great mercy to your servant David my father, because he walked before you in truth and in righteousness and in uprightness of heart with you. You have continued this great kindness for him, and you have given him a son to sit on his throne, as it is this day. Now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king instead of my father David. But I am a little child. I do not know how to go out or to come in. And your servant is in the midst of your people whom you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to be numbered or counted. Therefore give to your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of yours?' The speech pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this thing. Then God said to him, 'Because you have asked this thing, and have not asked for a long life for yourself, nor have you asked for riches for yourself, nor have you asked the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern justice, behold, I have done according to your words. See, I have given you a wise and understanding heart, so that there has not been anyone like you before now, nor shall anyone like you arise after you. I have also given you what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that there shall not be anyone like you among the kings all your days. So if you walk in my ways to keep my statutes and my commandments, as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days.' Then Solomon awoke, and indeed it had been a dream, and he came to Jerusalem and stood before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, offered up burnt offerings, offered peace offerings, and made a feast for all his servants." Now, verse 15 ends, and we're going to start in verse 15, then we'll go back. But verse 15 is really interesting because God gives him wisdom, the ability to discern right and wrong. And the very first thing that Solomon does is he goes to Jerusalem. He goes to the Ark of the Covenant. He goes to where they're supposed to worship God. And he offers sacrifice. So I think that is a point to show us that God guided him. He took him from worshiping in the high places where he wasn't supposed to showing him through wisdom even. This is the right place to worship. This is where I need to be. And we see that he is directing him. He is pulling him back towards him. But he does this because Solomon wanted to be there. You look at verse 6 and you see Solomon starts off with, "You're a great God." When we pray to God, one of the things that we like to talk about is the fact that we need to acknowledge and address God in a proper way. It's real easy for, me to talk to some people and, you say this, you say that, you go back and forth, you have a real casual conversation and, we're peers, we're equals. I'm not equal to God. If I was to meet the President of the United States, I would say, "Sir, yes, sir, no, sir." I would address him with respect. I would, consider the office in which he holds. We would treat that individual respectfully. And yet I hear people, when they talk about God or when they approach God in prayer, they say things like, "Yo, what's up?" And "Hey, Pops, how's it going?" Why? How do we think that that is even remotely appropriate? God is speaking to Solomon, and Solomon addresses him in such a way. He says, "You have shown great mercy." He basically says, "You are a great God. Look at all you've done. Thank you for that." He also shows great humility. Now, this is very much the least shall be the greatest shall be the least type mentality that God has throughout the Bible. He chose the smallest of people to make them a great nation. He chose the least of people to rise them up to be the leaders of his people. And here we see Solomon, he says, "Look, I'm but a child. I don't know how to even begin to process all of what I'm needing to do. My father was a great king, and I'm not there yet. I need help." And because he showed such humility, God said, "Okay, I will help you. I will give you the wisdom you need." But then God does something else. He says, "You show such humility, such willingness to try to serve me and to serve these people," which is what a king's supposed to do. He goes, "I'm going to do a couple more things for you. I'm going to give you riches, and I'm going to give you honor." Now, I want to point out two different things real quick. First off, when you look at what God does for wisdom, let's go ahead and go back to verse 12. If you're following on, go ahead and go to verse 12, and says, "Behold, I have done according to your words. See, I have given you a wise and understanding heart, so that there has not been anyone like you before you, nor shall any like you arise after you." Now, this is both ways. There's never been anyone who is as wise as Solomon in the days before, and there will not ever be anyone as wise as Solomon in the days after. Take note, there is no one who can compare to the wisdom that Solomon had, because he was blessed in such a manner that God says, look, no one is going to arise. Now, obviously, this excludes Christ. Jesus is a different situation altogether. When we look at comparisons like this, when we see that there was no one quite like Moses, there was no one quite like David, no one quite like Abraham. We talk about that, how they have special titles, the friend of God, the man after God's own heart. Jesus does not get included in these discussions because he is God himself. But here we see the Bible talking about Solomon says no one is ever going to have the wisdom you have. And we often talk about that, how no one will ever compare. But then he gives them a lesser bonus. And he says, you're going to have riches, you're going to have honor. And he says, in the days of your life. Now, this isn't, today, Bill Gates' wealth might very well rival the wealth of Solomon. We have people who have more capital and more wealth than small nations. So financially speaking, people can and do surpass the wealth of the kingdom of Israel and the wealth that Solomon had. But look at what it says. "And I have also given you what you have not asked," verse 13, "both riches and honor, so that there shall not be anyone like you among the kings all your days." Solomon, as long as he followed after God, and we see that this actually isn't even conditional on that, the length of his life is conditional on whether or not he follows God, and that's tragic. You actually have to wonder, how much longer would Solomon have reigned? How much longer would Solomon have been able to serve God and to bring Israel into the golden age that they had he just kept following after God? But we see he says, as long as you follow after me, your life will be extended. Walk in my ways, and your life will continue to be blessed. But he says, there's not going to be a king that can touch the wealth and the honor that you will have throughout all your days. That means Israel will be blessed beyond measure, because if the king is wealthy, then that's going to trickle down. That gives you this idea that Israel is wealthy. So Solomon, he wakes up, he realizes, hey, I had this dream, but God has spoken to me, and he goes and he offers burnt offerings, he offers peace offerings, and then he shares his joy with other people. Look at the end of verse 15. He made a feast for all his servants, not his close friends, not those that are, the princes of the land or the elders. He makes a feast for the servants. And that again shows the humble nature of Solomon. So chapter 3 starts off. We're looking at the first part of chapter 3. This is a short chapter. But we see in the first 15 verses that Solomon makes a mistake. He worships in the wrong place, and he's married someone that he really shouldn't be married to. But God gives him wisdom. God helps him. He shows how humble he is, how wonderful of a man he has the potential to be. And we really, you have to like Solomon here. You have to really think, hey, this is great. Solomon is following after the footsteps of David. David, while he was in his prime, was a great king. And then we know that this is after what we saw in chapter 2. This is the Bible telling us, hey, it's not all bad. Solomon does a lot of good. Now, the Bible takes a step back, and it starts in verse 16, and we'll read verse 16 through 28. It's going to show us Solomon's wisdom in action. And basically, this is a story that's only purpose is to show us that when God says he's going to do something, he does it, and he does it immediately. Verse 16, now 2 women who were harlots came to the king and stood before him. And one woman said, "O my lord, this woman and I dwell in the same house, and I gave birth while she was in the house. Then it happened the 3rd day after I had given birth that this woman also gave birth, and we were together. No one was with us in the house, except the 2 of us in the house. And this woman's son died in the night because she lay on him. And she arose in the middle of the night and took my son from my side, while your maidservant slept, and laid her in her bosom, and laid her dead child in my bosom. And when I arose in the morning to nurse my son, there he was dead. But when I had examined him in the morning, indeed, he was not my son whom I had borne. Then the woman said, No, but the living one is my son, and the dead one is yours. And the first woman said, No, but the dead one is your son, and the living one is my son." So, we get the action. We see what's going on here. 2 harlots, and basically they're prostitutes. The Bible really uses these type of women to illustrate that, justice can be served even to those who are, turning away from God. And, these women are doing things that they're not supposed to do. Prostitution was illegal. It was something that was sinful before God. But that doesn't mean they didn't deserve justice. That doesn't mean that they didn't deserve, some form of a godly life. And Solomon actually is going to show them and to give them, peace to the woman that actually deserves it here. And, we don't know what happens after that. The Bible's very quiet about it. But it shows us that God is taking care of even the sinful in the world. He's still there providing, because the account that's recorded for us is between 2 sinful women, and God giving wisdom to Solomon to settle their dispute even. So, God cares about all of us. But basically, pretty short story. Woman comes forward, says, "Hey, I gave birth, so did she. We live in the same house. There's no one there that can corroborate our story. She slept in a child and killed it, gave it to me. I found out. Now here we are before you because she has my child and I want it." The likelihood is that they had to go before some of the smaller courts before bringing this matter to Solomon. Solomon would not have just seen anybody. That's not how the kings at this point worked. But apparently this issue has traveled up, kind of like our Supreme Court, and no one was able to resolve it, and now it's before the king. And the king answers. You get to the very end of verse 22, it says, "Thus they spoke before the king." Then 23 says, "And the king said, the one says, 'This is my son who lives,' and your son is the dead one. And the other woman says, 'No, but your son is the dead one, and my son is the living one.' Then the king said, 'Bring me a sword.' So they brought a sword before the king, and the king said, 'Divide the living child in 2, and give half to one and half to the other.'" Now, when I was younger, I thought this story was hilarious. To think that King Solomon, to picture these two women standing there, and King Solomon like, hey, give me a sword. Now I'm a father. I don't find it nearly as funny. I empathize. I see the pain that this woman has. And I see the wisdom in what Solomon does. Because there is no way, if that was my child, I would allow harm to come to it. I would do anything to prevent that. So I see the wisdom. It's not a solution I would think of. It's not a solution that anyone would think of. Who would say, hey, let's cut a child in half to answer a problem of who gets it? To us, that's craziness. But the wisdom in which Solomon does is so clear because he understands the human heart and the human desire for love and compassion. He has wisdom that God gave him. Verse 26 continues, then the woman whose son was living spoke to the king, for she yearned with compassion for her son. And she said, O my lord, give her the living child, and by no means kill him. But the other said, let him neither be mine nor yours, but divide him. So the king answered and said, give the first woman the living child, and by no means kill him. She is his mother. And all Israel heard of the judgment which the king had rendered, and they feared the king. Now, this isn't like a fearful of, oh, we're scared of you. No, this is respect. For they saw that the wisdom of God was in him to administer justice. That's chapter 3. I do want to talk a few more minutes about some of the things that we just read. But I think it's interesting for us to see that chapter 3 is going to show us God has given Solomon the means to administer justice. He is making judgments. He is guiding a people that are supposed to be following God. And, their justice comes from the law of Moses. Now, obviously, the law of Moses isn't complete in terms of how a kingdom runs. There are going to be matters that, a kingdom has to have different laws for than, what the law of Moses contains. But it does show us that God is still capable of handling all the affairs of man. And it is the wisdom of God, as we read in verse 28. It's the wisdom of God that was able for him to administer this justice. I want you to place yourself for a moment in the mind of this woman who's lost her son. I can't comprehend how she could say, go ahead and kill it. But we're not told of anything that happens to her. I'm sure that she was punished. She's lied before a king. She's lied before, multiple court officials. She's stolen a child. But I do wonder at times if she wasn't overcome with grief herself. Because how can you say, okay, that's a great idea, let's cut the child in half, and then neither one of us? Was she so cold-hearted? Was she so hate-filled that she couldn't even get past her own grief? I don't think the Bible actually tells us, but it is something to think about, and it helps us to consider the reality that even in our loss, we need to make sure that we're not so desperate that we resort to such a sinful action, because God's justice in the end will prevail. I hope you've enjoyed our study of chapter 3 of the book of 1 Kings. We will continue next week. If you have any comments or questions, please be sure to leave them in the comment section, and we will pick back up then. Thank you.